Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for a Getting Started with ArangoDB Oasis webinar, first webinar of the year. I'm going to hand it over in just a minute to Ewout Prangsma. He is the architect of ArangoDB Oasis as well as the team lead, and he'll be walking you through the content today. You should see a Q&A button on the screen somewhere, so feel free to type in questions there as we go along, and we'll likely answer them at the end just so Ewout can get through the content. But don't be shy, send them in there and we'll be keeping tally of them. And with that, I will hand it over to Ewout to go ahead and get started.
Very good. Thank you very much, Amy.
Yeah.
Okay, good morning, good evening, wherever everyone is. It's great to see so many people here for getting started with ArangoDB Oasis. If you have any questions, as Amy said, please use the Q&A. If anything is really urgent, then just ping us in the chat and we can try to attend to that right away. So what are we going to talk about today? First of all, little introduction. And of course, the key part here is about seeing what ArangoDB Oasis is. So we're going to show it to you and getting started with your first deployment. We will, of course, first introduce what that word actually means. And we want you to make the right choices. So we're going to go through the most important configuration options that you have in Oasis. What do they mean and when should you choose which one? Then we're going to talk about how you can invite your colleagues, your co-workers, your freelancers, whatever you have, so that you can work together on your ArangoDB data. And finally, we're going to hit two, let's say, introductory slides, one on security and one on automation. And I want to already say it's really a quick start. We don't have the time today, and it's not the target of today to really dive into that deeply. If you want to know more, just get in touch with us. That's always possible. So with that said, let's get started with the actual stuff. So first of all, what is ArangoDB Oasis? And ArangoDB Oasis is the answer to a question that we have gotten many, many times. And that question or that message, no matter how you want to pronounce it, is usually something like, yeah, I really like your database and the graphs are cool and I'm really liking it, but I don't like running it. Can you please do that for us? I just don't have the time to invest, or I don't have the resources, I don't have a team to do that. Can you please do it for us? And of course, our answer to that is ArangoDB Oasis. And that's a platform where we can do exactly that. We can run ArangoDB for you, and we make sure that it runs in the place of your choosing. And we make sure, and that's probably the most important, that it also keeps running and that we manage it completely and make sure that there are no hiccups and so on. A couple of things that are important to know when you're talking about ArangoDB Oasis. There is a certain vocabulary there, and one of the most important words there is a deployment. And if you're not familiar with what a deployment in ArangoDB Oasis means, then it's probably a bit harder to work with it. So I want to get that clear from day one. And the deployment in Oasis means an ArangoDB cluster. So for those who are familiar with running an ArangoDB instance, whether it is single or cluster themselves, we have a couple of options there. For Oasis, we're always running cluster instances of ArangoDB. And that deployment is a cluster that is fully managed by the ArangoDB Oasis team. What kind of options do you have? And can I choose different things? Yes, we'll come to that in a minute. But first, another question that we hear often, and that is, and especially from EU customers, where is my data stored? It's not important for everyone, but we see lots and more, still more people that are very conscious of where their data is, and they want to be rest assured that they have full control over it. And what I want to make clear here is that the data is stored where you want us to store it. So you choose a cloud provider and you choose a region. For example, you can say, I want to run something in Google, and it should run in the Los Angeles region. Then all your data is going to be in the Los Angeles region. That applies to your current data that is right now in the database, but it also applies to the backups. So there is no chance that your deployment is in the US and then suddenly your backups are in Europe. That's not what we do. Maybe in the future there are certainly plans to provide features like that, but then you're talking about disaster recovery. For basic privacy and data locality issues, the data is always where you choose it. And then we make sure that we distribute that data wisely across the region. So almost all cloud providers and almost all regions have a concept of availability zones. So if one goes down, not everything goes down. We spread all over that, but everything still remains in that region. Another question that we also get often is, yeah, this is nice, but I still want to choose which version of ArangoDB I run because I like something better or I need certain features, so I need to follow that. Can I do that? And the answer is yes. Does that mean that you can run any version that ArangoDB has ever released? No. We are running relatively recent versions, and currently that means that we are on version 3.6 and version 3.7 of the ArangoDB database. But we are trying to be as close to the latest release version of ArangoDB. Usually it's a matter of a couple of days between ArangoDB releasing a certain version and it being available on Oasis. We don't have to do that much for that. It's just a matter of making sure that it is configured on the platform and we have to roll it out to all our versions. There are certainly also some versions that we are not going to allow or that we're going to remove over time. And for example, in the 3.6 range, we don't allow you to run any patch version of 3.6 because we know that certain bugs are being fixed. And then we say, okay, it's not wise to use a certain version anymore if we know that things are being fixed in the following patch release. So there is a certain limit there, but we are trying to be as, let's say, generous as possible when it comes to versions. I see a question in the Q&A. Is there another data needed by ArangoDB stored in some other place? Yeah, there is definitely some metadata. Of course, if you store information about the actual deployment, so let's say you want to run a deployment on Oasis, you sign up, and then we store some information of that. Namely, who are you and what did you choose to run for your deployment? All that information is stored in our deployments, and those are all running in the EU. Good, let's continue. Now the fun really starts because now we're going to create our first deployment. I'm not going to show you the entire process. It's just I have already signed up and I have the browser ready. So you start by going to cloud.arangodb.com. And then you first sign up. And I'm going to show you what it looks after you have signed up. And then you see a screen like this. You enter in the dashboard, and then it says, let's create your first deployment. And that's actually really easy because you just choose one. I'm Dutch, so I'm just going to be a bit more choosing and choose one in my region and say, let's create a deployment. Now I have to accept the terms and conditions, which I do, and now it is going to create a deployment for us while we speak. We're not going to wait for that while it's being bootstrapping. That is a process that typically takes somewhere like 10 to 20 minutes, depending on the cloud provider. So let's give that a minute. But you can see here the status. It says it's bootstrapping. And there is some basic information of we choose Google and we choose it to run in the Netherlands and so on. So let's move back. This is what's the easiest way to get started. We have now just launched our first deployment, and without us doing anything, the Oasis platform is currently creating that deployment for us. And as I said, it will take about, let's say, 15 minutes. And then it's going to tell me that it's ready. And it's going to do that by sending me an email. And in that email, you get a couple of things notified. One, it is going to send you a link to the database. And here I need to explain a bit about what it is that we are then giving you. We are first going to give you an endpoint to your deployment. That's listed here in the UI. I fitted it out for a screenshot, and also in the open UI, open endpoint, you go to that from the UI. For those familiar with ArangoDB, when you run an ArangoDB instance, whether it's single or cluster, it comes with a web interface. And the endpoint brings you to that web interface. And from there, you can go into the database, create collections, create additional databases, set up users, all the things that you are used to do with your ArangoDB instance. Now, a couple of other things that you see in this page here. We already just talked about the endpoint, and here we find the root password. We're not going to show you the root password, of course. We allow you to copy the root password, as for one of our security rules is please use the root password only once. Just use it to set up additional users and then don't touch it anymore. There is also something like a certificate that has to do with TLS, so the let's say the log that you see in the browser, and there is a concept of IP allow listing, something we'll discuss a bit further when we're talking about security. That's just going to Bootstrap. Let's see how far it is. It's actually already there. And you can see now here that I have a link to my database. And if I open that, I can see my database here. And if I log in, I'm copying the password, entering my credentials, and see if everything is already awake. And there it is. And now I'm in the standard interface of the Oasis, the ArangoDB Oasis database. And here I can start to create collections, create views, create all the things that you are used to in ArangoDB. So what is specific about what you see here? Actually, not that much. It is a standard version of ArangoDB. But it is a standard version of the enterprise version of ArangoDB. So all the enterprise goodies like smart joins and one shard and encryption and all that stuff that is in the enterprise version is available in Oasis as well. Now moving back here, so here we can see it live. I have a couple of tabs here, and I can show you some examples. We'll discuss that in a minute. I can also see what's under the hood here. So I can see all the different servers that are running in my cluster. I can deal with my backups, and I have policy that has to do with access control. Quick word on backups. The default policy is, as you can see here, that we're taking a backup every 2 hours. That is not something that is then going to upload. That's another feature that we have. It's going to take a very fast snapshot of your data, and it's an ideal way to go back to a point in time very quickly and fast. So now it is bootstrapped, and then of course is what do you do then with your deployment? So let's have some fun with it. And we have created a couple of examples for you to show you what you can do with your ArangoDB deployment. And all these examples are available just with a single click. You can install them, and it will install them in the deployment that you just created. Technically, that means that there is a database being added and we install some data in there. And if later you say, I'm not sure that I really like that, you can just click it away and uninstall it and the data is gone. We have a couple of examples. All of the examples come with a guide and it show you some queries that you can do and what is a typical way of doing this. So for example, for fraud detection, what is a typical way of doing fraud detection in ArangoDB? We really encourage you to try out these examples. It cannot hurt, you can throw it away, there's no worry in that. You can just try it and get a good example of what you can do with the ArangoDB database. Okay, and then it comes a point where you say, okay, this is great, but now what can I customize in this deployment? Because so far, the only thing that we have seen is that I chose to run in a Google region in the Netherlands, and that's about it. But you also talked about versions that I could choose and so on. And that is, I can go in and edit my deployment. And I can actually, since this one is already running anyway, I can show this live. We're actually able to edit the deployment. And now I can change things like a version. We can upgrade to another version. I can change my certificates or my IP allow listing. And by the way, the IP allow listing is typically for restricting where you can connect from towards your data. And then it goes a bit further because then we're talking about the configuration of the deployment. And for now, just note that there are a couple of configuration options. We're going to discuss them in a minute. And at the end, you see a summary and says, okay, this is my replication factor. It shows how much memory you have, how much storage, and it also shows you what the price of this deployment is if you continue after the free to try period, which, by the way, is 14 days. If you make changes, just save it afterwards. For now, I'm just going to cancel it and it's going to go back. So those are the basic options that you can play with, and let's discuss them a little bit further in more detail. But before I do that, I take a quick look at the Q&A. Are you planning implement Oasis on other cloud providers? At the moment, we have 3, and there are currently no plans for others. Let's see, the list is rather long, so I'm going to come back to the rest at the end of the session. So choosing the right configuration. There are a couple of configuration options that we have already seen. So the cloud provider and the region. That's relatively straightforward, but then there are a couple of more that are really specific to an ArangoDB database. First of all, the deployment model, which can be one shard or sharded. We'll discuss which one in a minute. You have node size, CPU size, and disk size. Those are the key parameters. So let's discuss them one by one. First of all, the deployment model. That's the most important decision that you would make. And I often speak with customers, and many of them are asking, okay, what should I choose? The default for Oasis is one shard, but I also have this sharded, and when should I pick which one? And that depends on your use case. In the end, it determines a bit of how we set up an ArangoDB cluster, and that is optimized in the direction of a certain use case. For one shard, it is optimized for graphs. So if you do a lot of graph traversal, definitely go with one shard. If on the other hand, you say, well, this graph thing is nice, but I'm not using it. I just want to store a large number of documents. Fine, then go with sharded. It's optimized for that use case. If you have anything in between, then it, of course, becomes a bit harder to make that judgment call. If it's leaning more towards graph, I would always go with one shard until the point where you have really a very large number of documents. Then, but if that's the case, you could also reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to give you some advice on that one. For each of these deployment models, there are different scaling options, and that is the restriction. So for one shard, you can only scale vertically. That means that you can take bigger nodes, but you cannot take more nodes. One shard, you have 3 nodes, you start with 3 nodes and you end with 3 nodes. There's no choice there. For sharded, you start with 3 nodes, but you can grow pretty much as large as you want. So there you have the option to scale both horizontally, namely increase the number of nodes, as well as vertically. So get to bigger nodes. And with that, you can mix and match and get the best possible performance for your deployment. And the last thing that I want to say on the deployment model is the upgrade scenarios that you have. If you are on one shard, you can upgrade to sharded, but the other way around is not possible. So it's usually the best, just start with one shard unless you know that sharded is the best for you, because you can always go to sharded, but you cannot go back, at least not without dumping data and so on. That's about the deployment model. Then about node size. And node size is actually, it sounds like one configuration option, but it's actually 2.5, 3 in that range, because node size relates to the amount of memory that you have in a node, but it also relates to the amount of CPU resources that you have available per node. Excuse me. And for CPU, we have the distinction between general and low CPU, but everything starts with a node size. And now the question is, how do I choose which node size I need? You wouldn't imagine how many times a day I get asked that question, and the answer is always the same, and that is, it depends. And that's a very boring answer, but unfortunately it's true. But we want to give you a guide of guidelines of, if you use a certain feature, how does that impact my memory usage? How does it impact my CPU and so on? For example, if you're just reading, writing documents, the most basic functionality, the impact on memory is low. What that means is you can go with a small node size. For example, the A4, you can store, read and write a very large number of documents without a large impact on the database. It will just do that without that much memory and that much CPU. Impact on disk, of course, on the other hand, can be rather large. If you have a large number of documents, then of course your disk usage will grow. Index usage of documents. Here it becomes a bit more tricky. A few indexes don't take that much memory, but it grows with the amount of data. So more indexes plus more documents equals more memory. And the key part of indexes, of course, is that you really want to have them in memory, otherwise they don't function anymore, or at least they're not useful. So that's where it becomes tricky. But when you go to graphs, it becomes a different story. Graphs need more memory. So that's why we say the impact is somewhere between medium and high. And the CPU impact is also at least more than low. So we see use cases where people have relatively small number of documents. In the graph case, though, we're talking about vertices and edges and so on. But in the end, there are documents. With a relatively small number of documents, you can still have very complex graph queries. You can do a lot of traversals very quickly, but it will take memory. And it will also take a certain amount of CPU, usually at very little disk space. Of course, we also see the other side where people have huge graphs with huge disk space and so on, so then it just becomes bigger. For search, you need more memory and more CPU. That's really clear. And for some Fox services, it's a bit in between. And for backups, it's low on memory, but it can mean something for CPU, especially if you want to do it very often. So if you can use this table as a kind of first-hand guideline of, okay, this is what I should look for. But in the end, I always encourage people to just play with it. You can change your deployment size, and in the end, you have to figure out for your use case, for your set of data, what is the best combination that I want to use. So really play around with it. That's about configuration. Now let's talk about inviting your colleagues, because if you start and what we call organization is created for you, that organization has a name, doesn't mean anything other than for yourself. But as long as you're alone in your organization, it's not that much fun. It becomes more fun if you can invite your colleagues. The way to do that is to go to the people tab, to the people page in the navigation, which is indicated on the left, and then invite a member. You just enter an email address, hit send, and that person will be invited. So it's not a process that you're actively adding someone. That person still has to consent to it and accept the invitation, and then he is part of your organization. That does not automatically mean that that person can do anything in your organization, but because that is determined by the permission system. It goes too far in getting started to really talk about the details of the permission system, but just rest assured, it's there, you can configure it, and you can do a lot with it. There's not a real limit of how many colleagues you can invite. We see some organizations have a large number of users, some have just one or two. It's anywhere which you choose. So let's do some quick starts on two topics. One is security, and then the one next is going to be automation. Of course, I cannot stress enough, this is really a quick start. A topic like security deserves its own webinar, and there is a lot to say about it. So please don't say, well, I've heard Ewout talk about this one page and I'm doing that and now I'm done. No, unfortunately not. It's really a getting started, but let's talk about the most basic ones. I already mentioned the root password. The root password of your deployment, we really encourage you to use it once. And after that, create additional users in your deployment, which you use for your normal operation. So that is your normal read, write, query behavior, but also your normal administration behavior. You should see the root password as essentially a user of last resort, and don't use it again. The next thing is IP allow list. In the example deployment that I just created, I didn't set one up. That is a huge mistake. You should always do that. And if you haven't done so, I would encourage you heavily to go back and edit your deployment and make sure that you have an IP allow list. What does that do? It gives you the possibility to say this deployment should be reachable only from this set of IP addresses or ranges of IP addresses. So put in your IP addresses for your office, for your home offices, whatever, or for your application servers, whatever you need, but there is no need that somebody from the other side of this planet is able to access your deployment. You should just not do that. These things are configured as so-called sitter, that's IP ranges. And it looks something like 4 numbers / and then a number. And that number at the end is anywhere between 0 and 32. There are good Wikipedia articles about that, and we give you some examples of what to do. What you should never do in there is 0000/0, because that means everyone has access. So it's essentially throwing away the allow list feature. And then you can control permissions, who can do what with the deployments using policies. Typically, you don't start by setting up policies. You first start playing with deployments and so on. And only when your organization grows, you start setting up policies. Then it becomes relevant. Also, when your organization grows, or when you have specific use cases, for example, multi-tenant use cases, or you're providing a service to many tenants, you can consider grouping your deployments in different projects. So within one organization, by default, you have one project, but you can make more projects. So you can say everything that is related to the sales organization, we put in the sales project, and everything that's related to the development organization, we put in the development project. That's one way of organizing it. You can also say, no, I'm doing it differently. I'm creating a project for my production use cases, and I'm creating another project for my staging or testing use cases. In the end, it's completely up to you. It's just essentially a folder structure that you can use, but it's also a folder structure that comes with its own set of permissions. So you can say this person in our testing project can do anything, but that same person in our production project can do only limited things. That you can mix and match there and play around with that. Again, these are really the basics about security. I encourage everyone, read the documentation and make sure that you use it wisely. And then some words on automation. I already saw a question in the chat. Can this all be scripted? The answer is yes. Everything that you can do in Oasis can be done through an API. To be precise, everything that I've demoed you today is done through an API. The web interface that we have for the Oasis platform is just a user of the API, nothing more. And that API comes in a couple of different forms. The most easy to use, if you want to talk about scripting, is our Oasis CTL command line tool. It is a application, command line application that is available for Windows, Mac, Linux, not yet the ARM MacBooks, but we will be there very soon. And you can control the ArangoDB Oasis platform from the command line. So instead of going to the website and clicking, I want to create a new deployment, you can also script it with Oasis CTL. You can run something like Oasis CTL, create deployment, give it some arguments, and it will launch a deployment for you. You can do the same with our Terraform plugin. Terraform plugin is not yet up to, let's say, GA status. We hope to get there soon, but it's still, may still see a couple of changes. And last but not least, of course, you can also use the API in your own application. Our API is a gRPC API, so that means that there is a so-called protocol buffer specification of that. A lot of technicalities. In the end, it means you can easily create a client in pretty much any programming language that you can think of. Whether it is Go, C, Rust, Python, we don't really care. We provide you with the protocol buffers that are available on our GitHub page. We generate the Go client with that, but if you want to run a C# application in it, go ahead, just generate them. That's not a problem. Now, what would you use the API for? As I said before, in the end, you use it to do anything that you can do on Oasis. But a very typical use case is CI, continuous integration. For example, you have your application running, and every night you want to run it against a ArangoDB Oasis deployment to run all your tests. Well, you can do that. Your CI can use Oasis CTL or directly the API to spin up a deployment, to wait for that deployment to be ready, and then run your test. And when all the tests are done, throw that deployment away again. You can even go a step further. You can say, well, it's nice that I can run it against some random new empty deployment, but wouldn't it be nice if I can run it against my production data without risking the production database? And actually you can. Oasis comes with a feature, what we call clone from backup, which means that you can take any backup that you, for example, create now, and then say, create me a new deployment from that backup. It means that you get a second deployment, but with the data of the first one without putting your first production deployment at risk. It's a great way for testing. It's a great way for also trying out new versions of ArangoDB and so on. You can onboard new colleagues. If you have set up a completely automated system to onboard colleagues, you can also do that with Oasis. You can give them access, you can invite them, set up all the permissions and so on. Last, well, there are many use cases out there, but the last one that I want to discuss is scale for the Friday afternoon rush. Let's say that you have some web shop and you do expect every Friday I get this rush of, and I need to scale up on Friday, and Friday at the end of the day, I'm going to scale down. You can do that. And you can do that automatically. So you can put it on a timer or whatever. You could even put it on certain metrics and do that. In the end, it's your creativity, how much you can think of what you can do with the API. And in all honesty, we love to hear from you guys. So if you have a great use case that you're doing with the API or doing with ArangoDB Oasis in general, please let us know. We always love to hear about that. And with that, we come at the end of the series of slides. So now it's time for questions. So let me first have a look at the Q&A. How are upgrades to newer versions of ArangoDB handled? Is there downtime during the upgrade? Let me start by the second question. The answer to that is no. An upgrade to a newer version is you go in and edit your deployment. You select your newer version. Of course, you can also do this with the API, and then you hit save. It's not that it's then automatically ready with the new version. What happens then is that a process starts that is going to restart all of the servers of your ArangoDB cluster one at a time and upgrade them to the new version. So if you were to do that and look into the server tab of the Oasis platform, you can see them being upgraded one at a time. So there will be a rotation icon that says, I'm now going to upgrade this one, and then you see it popping up to the new version. Does that mean that there is downtime? No, there is no downtime. Your data is still there. It can be because these servers are being restarted, that your application needs to reconnect. That is absolutely fine, and your application has to be prepared for that. But the data is always there, and because we're storing at 3 replicas of every piece of data, there is always still one server available to answer your question. More precise, of the 9 servers that you start with, there are always 8 there ready to do something. So the only thing that you may see, but it's already very unlikely, is a slight bit of less performance in certain sharded cases. For the one shard, you don't even see the difference. Okay. And then there is a second question. I meant data that is needed in runtime. I would ask the person who please elaborate on that question, because for me it's not clear yet. Moving on to the next one. On backups, is that backup of the entire system, all databases, or a single database? This is a very good question. The backups in Oasis are a backup of the entire system. There are also tools for ArangoDB, namely ArangoDump and Restore, and they're still functional with Oasis as well, that can very selectively backup and restore collections, databases, and so on. The general backup functionality is a snapshot of the whole entire deployment. Okay, with Oasis, do you have access to the settings of the ArangoDB config file? No, you do not. But if you need specific settings, there is a possibility to submit a support ticket to us and say, can you please change this setting for us? We can do that to a certain extent. And with that, I mean, we allow you to make certain configuration changes, but for just practical and security reasons, we do not allow you to touch just any settings that's out there, but there are lots of settings that you can play with. And if you really need that, reach out to us through a support ticket. You can go into the Oasis dashboard and request a support ticket and then say, okay, this is the deployment. Can you please do it like this? And then we can do that for you. And the next question is, can you give document count examples for small, medium, and large collections? It's a very good question. Yes, I could, but it doesn't mean that much. Let me explain why. So I have seen collections with only 100 documents, which is a very low number of documents, but with 2 gigabytes of data per document. And then suddenly it becomes a large collection. So it's hard to say when is something small and when is something large. If you have your typical document that contains just a number of fields, then a small one is a few thousand documents and a large one is maybe many billions of documents. But in the end, it really depends on how much data do you put in the document, how much indexes do you have, and so on. Next question. I'm currently running ArangoDB 3.4 on an M5X large EC2 instance with 50 gigs. Why do you think I should switch to ArangoDB Oasis? This is a very good question. I think the reasons why you would consider switching is that it is fully managed. And that's one. And second, as I read your question, you're currently running a single instance, which is definitely not highly available. So if you're upgrading, your data is no longer available for the time that you're upgrading. And in the end, nobody is monitoring. Of course, the EC2 instance is monitored by AWS, but nobody is monitoring your ArangoDB instance. If you want to do that monitoring for yourself, it's perfectly fine. I'm not here to tell everyone you have to go to Oasis, otherwise you cannot run ArangoDB. That's definitely not the case. But if you want to run ArangoDB in a production environment and do not have the know-how or the team or the wish to manage it yourself, then Oasis is a great solution for you. Okay, again, is there any data not in the designated region that is needed in runtime? The answer to that is no. All your data is in that region, and there is nothing there that is coming from some other region in order to run your database. Final question. Currently, what are the cloud service providers supported by ArangoDB Oasis? At the moment, we have 3 providers. That is Google, AWS, and Microsoft Azure. And for each provider, we have roughly a handful of regions. And maybe I should say a couple of words about these regions. We get lots of questions along the lines of, yeah, this is nice, but do you support region and then some AWS region or some Google region or whatever? The way that we work with that is based on popular demand. For us, it's relatively easy to add a new region, but because of the way that the platform is set up, it doesn't make sense for us to set up a region just for one very small deployment. We want it to be just a little bit more. So if you have a need for either a bigger deployment or more deployments and you're looking for a certain region, do get in touch with us because usually then the answer is, yeah, we can do it within a couple of days. Then I have a question. Is there monitoring alerting facilities if ArangoDB is struggling to cope with the load? That is a very good question. And that's actually a question that is currently changing in the Oasis platform. So there's more coming there. Let me elaborate on that. At the moment, you can see in the ArangoDB Oasis dashboard and also in the API what the current memory, CPU, and disk load of your servers is. It doesn't say you everything there is to know, but it gives you a very rough indication of how your servers are doing. At the moment, we are working very hard on finalizing a metrics solution. And with that metrics solution, you will get an additional endpoint. Will be the same domain, but a different port. And on that endpoint, you will be able to query very detailed metrics of your deployment. That is available in a format that is supported by Prometheus, which is one of the leading metrics collection and also alerting stack on top of that tools out there. So then you will be able to grab your metrics of your deployment, and it goes really into very deep detail. So you not only see what is my memory doing, but you can also see what are the caches for my RocksDB storage engine deep down in my deployment are doing. How many slow queries do I have? What is the load on this queue? And there's a lot more things that you can answer there. We are going to provide that endpoint with some example dashboards, which will be available for Grafana on top of that Prometheus. And we're also going to integrate a selection of those into the Oasis dashboard. Last on that list of struggling aspects is about disk space. We see that disk space is a very critical resource for any database, but definitely also for ArangoDB. So at the moment, we are working on an additional service that is constantly monitoring the database usage of your deployment. And as soon as your database usage grows above a certain threshold, then you will get a warning email that says, please scale up. Because the last thing that you want to do is to run out of disk space. Database does not really like that situation, so you want to prevent for that. And that relates to the last question that I see, is auto scaling an option? And at the moment, the answer to that is no. You can, of course, with our API, monitor the situation and scale up by yourself. But that is something that is coming later this year, where we also give you the possibility to define some rules based on how you want to scale. So then it's no longer that you say, I want to have this amount of this space per node. It's more of the range of, I have a range of this size, take a disk size anywhere between this minimum and this maximum, and between there, just take whatever you need in order to fill the data. Are there any more questions? Right now, there are no more open questions. So if there are, then I would say on questions, raise them now. Of course, if they're not, and you feel later on, hey, I still have a question, please reach out to us. You can reach out, and let me show that. You can reach out to me directly. You can reach out definitely for technical issues with your deployments. Always use the support request on the Oasis dashboard. It's by far the most effective way to get in touch with us. But if you have general questions or just want to know more about the platform or have sales questions, do reach out. We are more than happy to talk to you about that. And if you're doing cool stuff with ArangoDB or ArangoDB Oasis or our API, do let us know. It's very much appreciated. With that, if there are no further questions, then I want to thank everyone for the time to listen to our story. We very much appreciate it. Go to Oasis, go to cloud.arangodb.com, sign up, and take your 14-day free try. Give it a try, and if you like it, just sign up with your credit card. It's just 5 minutes, and we're more than happy to manage your deployment. So thank you very much for your time, and have fun with ArangoDB. Thank you.